I was asked to speak on the evolution and achievements of European integration, to provide a kind of background, I think, to the more specific commentaries that you're going to receive on various aspects of the EU's present today. Consistent with that remit, I'm using the same title, but I'm inverting the words. The title of this paper is Achievements and Evolution of the European Union. Now, I've done this not just to be cantankerous, but because it involves a correct chronology. I think, as an historian, my judgment is that the achievements of the European Union were those in its early years, its early formative years, and the evolution of the European Union then has followed a somewhat uncertain course. Past practice is, of course, in history never a guarantee of future performance. And in the case of the European Union, we've seen a rocky road, periods of progress alternating with periods of stagnation, and over the past 5 years, a period of real deterioration. In fact, the future survival of the EU is an open question. The EU faces nothing less than a crisis of existence. At the heart of the problem is an unpleasant reality. The European Union stands for democracy and even spreads it, but it does not put its words into practice. Elites designed and have since managed the European Union and its forerunners run it from the top down and without benefit of either public approval or political consent. The European Union has been governed on the basis of what, up to this point, has been referred to as permissive consensus. And what it means is the European public accepted the decision-making authority delivered from on high, be it by the heads of state and council or by the senior bureaucrats in Brussels, in the belief that the integration process had a valid purpose. This matter of faith has been called into question, and the context of European politics fundamentally changed. The key event here is the so-called double whammy. The rejection in 2 referenda held within a week of each other in May and June 2005 concerning the proposed European Constitution, a statement that one must apostrophize because that is not its correct name. This Constitution is an odd and ungainly document of 800 pages whose meaning is unclear even to those who drafted it. Although the dominant trend, the dominant motif in that Constitution is that it would be a step towards a closer federal union of the European peoples. The setback came as a huge surprise to Brussels, and its repercussions are still being felt. In retrospect, it's obvious that someone, somewhere, should have been sitting at the switch, because there are harbingers of it. There was a near rejection of the Maastricht Treaty by the French in the early 90s, followed by its rejection by the Danes, and then they were overridden. Later, the rejection of the Nice Treaty by the Irish, who were once again overridden. There was the Euro referendum in Sweden in 2003, when the Swedes decisively voted against accepting the euro and continued on with the Swedish crown. I was there at the time, and I can assure you that the no side, which was victorious, was outpointed in terms of campaign expenditures by a minimum of 10 to 1. And I will add to this that a tragic event occurred 2 days before the scheduled vote. That is the assassination, the senseless assassination of the most attractive political figure in Sweden, Anna Lindh, who was, in fact, the chief spokesperson for the yes cause. In spite of this, the Lady Di penumbra effect, the Swedes came out in great numbers and decisively rejected the euro. So someone should have known that something was wrong, and that the more the public was learning about the EU, the less it liked what it saw. Since the referenda, the rules of the integration game have now changed. The peoples of Europe have become participants in a game they've never played before. The EU now faces some very hard choices. It either must become generally democratic or shed its political identity and be reduced to a purely functional economic organization, which, if it works properly, can continue to play an important, though secondary role in Europe's destinies. However, to do this will require far-reaching structural change, that is, a fundamental overhaul of European institutions. If the European Union continues to sputter and misfire as it has in the past 5 years, it will, like the League of Nations, retreat into obscurity. To appreciate what's at stake here, one should begin with a reminder that the EU's two greatest past achievements, of the EU's two greatest past achievements, these achievements belong to the cluster of events which marked a watershed between the first half of the 20th century, an era of war, depression, despotism, and the present, much happier period of peace, prosperity, and social progress. So these are, put another way, the founding of the EU and the early years of European integration are part of the seminal process that fundamentally changed the character of European life in the 20th century. Now let me say a few words about the European achievement. First, the launching of European integration in the years after 1945 ruled out a return to the era of competitive and anti-democratic nationalism which plagued Europe in the first half of the century. Other new factors were also seriously in play. In other words, I'm saying now that we can't give sole credit for this change to the European Union, and I only have time to remind you of what they might be. I'll mention two. After two world wars, Europeans were sick of bloodshed. In other words, there's a fundamental change in mood that is evident and has been referred to several times. Moreover, the United States was on hand with NATO to guarantee European security during the Cold War. Perpetuating peace, of course, requires more than just the prevention of war. Bonds of friendship must be strengthened between nations. The process of doing this began with the founding in 1951 of something now largely forgotten, the European Coal and Steel Community. It produced a new diplomatic tradition, one embedded in institutions designed to promote economic and political cooperation and aimed ultimately at binding the peoples of Europe more closely together in a community of shared political values. And I realize that's a mouthful, but it's an important mouthful. The ECSC, that is the Coal Steel Pool, would become the predecessor of the European Economic Union, whose 50th birthday, the EU, whose 50th birthday we're now commemorating this year. Now, the long-term aim of fostering a closer union between peoples by promotion of good government has become a living tradition, thanks chiefly to the stabilization of European democracy in the post-World War II years, but also thanks to the specific contribution of the EU. Thanks to its support and encouragement, the Spanish and Portuguese nations shed right-wing authoritarian systems of rule inherited from before the Second World War and have become modern democracies. Today, the peoples of the former Soviet bloc are making good progress in the even more difficult transition from despotic communism to self-government and open markets. Now, as ever, the EU's most critical mission should be to strengthen democracy both within and along Europe's borders. The future of the European Union, as well as security of Europe, may well hinge on the effective discharge of this historic responsibility. The European integration process also deserves credit for a second, in this case, great economic achievement. It reversed a destructive trend towards economic autarky, which by stifling growth in the 1920s and 30s, both added to the fund of human misery in Europe and contributed to the moral and political breakdown that eventually led to World War II. Surely without the EU, or something very much like it, today's Europe would be a far less prosperous and much less pleasant place. The contribution of other parties to this happy outcome deserves recognition. The United States earned Europe's gratitude and the world's for championing global economic liberalization in the decades after World War II. This policy provided the framework for European integration. Its landmarks, many of them are familiar: the Marshall Plan, today's WTO and IMF, and yes, even the modern European Union. Without intense, behind-the-scenes American pressure, the European Coal and Steel Community, that is, the first of Europe's great post-World War II transnational institutions, the ECSC, would never have gotten off the drawing board. The U.S. can take pride in having encouraged and supported the integration process over most of the past 50 years. It's an issue that I can only mention. I can't go into it in detail, obviously, in the short time that I have to talk. Trade liberalization also had important secondary effects on European integration. By promoting growth in changing contexts, it brought about the rise of the multilateral corporation in Europe and triggered the creation of both new offshore financial markets and the successive big and little bangs, which in the 1980s reformed stodgy European stock markets and created vast new pools of cheap credit. The EU and its predecessor organizations also have their own impressive list of achievements. They include the adoption of the common external tariff in the early years of the EEC, the elimination of the so-called non-tariff barriers by means of the Single European Act of 1986, and the subsequent progress made towards the creation of the single European market. Although the process of breaking down protectionism and enforcing fair competition is long-term, incomplete, and subject to setback, the glass of market liberalization is at least half full. Yet the adoption of the Single European Act in 1986 marks in retrospect the high water mark of economic liberalism in the EU. The European Monetary Union, it now becomes clear daily, has been an historic mistake. The price convergence that it promised has not taken place. Trade within the EU has grown less rapidly than trade between the EU and the rest of the world. Growth, moreover, has been slowed by the EMU, or so it appears, both in terms of GDP and per capita and growth and productivity. The differential has increased between the United States and the US in the years that it's been operating, and especially in the last 5 years. And globalization calls into question the very utility of an organization, a European regional economic organization. It's going to have to do better if it is not going to be eroded by the new global situation. The EU has failed to meet past economic tests and must rise to the challenge if it wants to remain important in the future. These challenges are vast, in some ways larger than anything the EU has dealt with before or tried to deal with before. They include, just to do a little tick off a few things, the rise of what in France is called economic patriotism. And that is the encouragement, the efforts, the attempts of government to introduce various protectionist measures, always more often, increasingly, I should say, more often, under the rubric of a new kind of economic ideology. So the rise of economic patriotism, especially in France, is an issue. So too is another economic one that's related not only to economics but politics and social values, and that is the so-called immigration problem, which I don't see as a problem, but certainly presents the political challenges with which the EU is ill-equipped to adapt. And then finally, there is a whole question which I'm very pleased will be discussed in greater length in this conference of the resurgent Russia with enormous reserves of energy upon which Europe depends. So there are economic challenges as well as political ones. The question now is the guide, I should say, is the past a reasonable guide to Europe's future? Evolution, which is the second issue I'm supposed to talk about, or an analysis of it, will point to a few important conclusions which may guide us in the direction of a correct answer but not provide it. I'd like to make a few rather basic points, I think, if only to clear up certain myths that surround the history of the EU. The first thing is that the present organization is by no means the product of a single grand design or the handiwork of a single great man. Two powerful figures have a claim for such a role, and I'll just mention their names because they will probably come up again and again in our discussions. The first of them is Jean Monnet, the Frenchman often referred to as the founding father of Europe. Monnet inspired, designed, and negotiated and headed the European, that is, as the president of the European coal and steel community, whose importance I've already underscored. Yet this organization, about which it will surprise you, I wrote a book, failed economically and organizationally. Consequently, the statesmen who negotiated the present EU, that is the foreign organization, the European Economic Community, quite deliberately sidelined Monnet and adopted a fundamentally different institutional design. So Monnet was as an active participant in this integration process was out of the mainstream at a fairly early date. I must add, the man was immensely was intellectually immensely prolific and introduced new ideas, thoughts, notions, and into the so-called European discourse all the way up into the 1970s. But Monet failed in his fundamental bid to create a political Europe on the basis of, if you want, of central economic direction. This attempt was taken up again in the mid-1980s and pursued with extreme tenacity by a second great potential or would-be Euro visionary, Jacques Delors, D-E-L-O-R-S, whose work, however, was, I think, even less successful than Monet's. As president of the European Commission from the mid-80s to the 90s, Delors put the European Union on an ambitious, though misguided, course of institution building, which is the source of the EU's present problems. It led to organizational nightmare, to the rejection of the Constitution, and has brought Europe to its present, the European Union to its present plight. So that was a simple point about the role of great men in the history of European Union. I think it's been exaggerated. If one takes a careful look at the pattern of the EU's development over the past 50 years, what one sees is a zigzag pattern in which progress alternated with prolonged periods of stagnation and more recently, even regression. Over this lengthy time period, major institutional changes have taken place. I've simply referred to one of them. That is the replacement of the ECSC's model of central economic direction, dirigisme it's called in French, with a more open model that was adopted that was negotiated for the European Economic Community, that is the forerunner of today's EU. There are other examples which, if time allowed, I could discuss at length, but won't. But the point here is that one does not find a regular pattern of change, either temporally or, if you want, qualitatively. What one sees at work in these changes, however, is a conflict between two fundamentally different principles of organization and ultimately two different visions of what Europe should become. This is, on the one side, market competition, and on the other side, bureaucratic centralization. The contestants for these two fundamental, I should say different, if you want, polar notions of what Europe should become, has coursed through the generation and a half of European integration that is now behind us. And it rages on today in ongoing policy disputes between the successors of institution builders like Jacques Delors and his successors, as well as those who, like Margaret Thatcher, share the view that market opening should be the main EU policy. At work here is nothing less than a struggle for the soul of the European Union. Everyone has a position on this issue, and what I'm going to say a few words about is mine without, I think I should identify it as such, and not suggest that it represents a consensus, which it certainly does not. I've talked about zigs and zags, and I've talked about periods of progress alternating with periods of stagnation and regression. The zigs above, and my apologies for getting into matters that might seem a little bit technical, the zigs above that I pointed to mark the progress of ascendant market liberalism. The zags are those times, or represent those times or occasions when dirigistes have held the upper hand in the policy-making process. The periods of inactivity and reversal follow the zags, that is, the repeatedly frustrated attempts to build Europe along, if you want, the model of a centralized economic and political control. That's called positive integration. What is the only approach that successively worked over time is so-called negative integration. That is the free market position, which by opposing thou shalt not rules, in other words, antitrust law being a perfect example in the European version, has imposed regulations that have facilitated the optimal functioning of the market system. Now, I pointed out that through the most of the years of the EU's life, these two principles have been at work, and that the failure of the constitutional project, as I see it, at any rate the rejection of it in the two critical referenda, have changed the rules of the game. The public must now be brought in my view, if the European Union is going to realize the hopes of those who consider it essential to Europe's destinies. The trick will be to keep the of keeping the EU at the forefront of progress involves devising a plan to promote market reform and decentralization without at the same time sacrificing the long-term goal of closer cooperation between Europe's peoples. One could talk about threading a needle, one could talk about unsnarling a ball of yarn. It's not going to be easy to do, but some balance must be arrived at between these two different priorities if Europe is to realize the potential that those of us hope it will. Now, the problem here, and this is one that I simply don't have the time to get into, but I'll be delighted to entertain any questions you have about it in the period that follows. The problem is that the European Union has not been built in some sort of methodical manner. It has not followed a blueprint, as I said. It has been born of crisis in many cases, and changed in response to a series of crises. It is a jury-rigged apparatus that does not function well. I don't want to go into the details of this. As I say, they would take up too much of what time remains. But the point is that you cannot imagine that the sort of executive control that those who want to build a federal Europe often posit is actually functional. Some EU institutions operate independently of others. A whole host of so-called non-majoritarian ones, agencies and so on, outside the original structure of the Commission or the Commission and the Council and the Parliament. They just exist out there, hovering in a kind of never-never land of administrative law. The most important of these institutions is the European Monetary Union. This is probably the most important European institution, period. But it doesn't answer to anybody. It doesn't answer to any organ in Brussels. It's only indirectly and remotely responsible to a committee composed of finance ministers of the various members of Euroland. But basically, it answers to itself. This is a very important point for policy coordination. Increasingly, what one finds is that these various institutions of the EU are working at cross purposes to itself, and that the gap between policy priority and operational reality in Brussels and its sort of institutional outliers is growing. The EU, indeed, has a severe credibility problem that seems to grow more serious month by month and year by year. Now, a couple of words about change, which are quite consistent with what I've said so far. The European integration process has passed through a number of stages. But these stages, the timetable, and the methods used at advancing this process has not been dictated by Brussels or any other single authority. Rather, what has been critical are exogenous influences, things happening outside the European Union that have changed the context of politics and economics and opened up pathways of new development that then have been followed by astute statesmen. A future change will may well require, as in the past, similarly, changes at both the national level, that is, of domestic politics, and the international level. What they'll be precisely, no one can predict. I'd simply want to make one point about how this change has occurred in the time that remains to me, and it's a technical one. But if you're trying to understand how the EU works, it's essential. The biggest break in the EU's history came not with an event in Brussels, but with the dethronement of the dollar in 1971 and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system was conceived chiefly by, there were plenty of other people involved, by John Maynard Keynes in the Bretton Woods, New Hampshire conference that took place in the end of 1944 and early 1945. It was a system of pegging convertible currencies to the dollar. They all had dollar equivalencies. It put those countries, let's say Europe, that had convertible currencies on the dollar standard, the dollar gold standard. These currencies were to have, relatively speaking, a fixed value to the dollar. This system was adopted in order to prevent changes in the world market from affecting the operation of planned European economies. The idea of planning was fundamental to the operation of the system. The system collapsed not because of the collapse of planning, but because of American payments problems. And it was seen at the time as a disaster for American policy. In retrospect, it was a boon for both Europe and for the United States. After the collapse of the system, American growth started, the gap between American and European growth would close over the next few years and then move the other way. It fundamentally changed the politics of Europe as well. It opened the way to the kind of free market reform advocated by Margaret Thatcher and those people called neoliberals who, although they didn't nominally or outwardly support her views, which were highly controversial, adopted the policies that were in effect made in England because they seemed to work whereas others didn't. This is a vast subject, and I can't get into it. You have others speaking on the economy who are, if not equally knowledgeable, well, certainly more knowledgeable than I am on this point. But it is an example of change coming outside the European Union that fundamentally changed its institutions and its operating mechanisms. Whether and how something can happen, similar can happen again, is a question that will have to be answered in the future. There isn't much time for me to get into the really important issues the really important issue of the origins of the European Union's present difficulties. I simply want to say that the effort to build, that dominated the 1990s, to build a federal European state, complicated the existence of the EU, and today even has jeopardized it. It has put layer upon layer of law and in many cases of administration piled on top of each other. The real casualty in this has been the relationships, but the new agreements between the member states, and I can't say more than this, that made possible the advances of the 80s and 90s. The European Council. The European Council politically saved the European Union from its inability to develop as a kind of executive organ. It became a kind of a cooperative venture sponsored by the Germans, the French, and followed by the others. Cooperation in the European Council became impossible over the 1990s. The breakdown in this is what led to the proposal for a new European constitution that would eliminate those features those institutional features that made the EU almost ungovernable. This is an interesting subject. I can't go into it here. What I have time for are a few reflections on the significance of what has gone on in the past 50 years of the history of the European Union. These are very simple points, but I think some of them are worth remembering. The creation of what is today the European Union should be recognized as having been one of those critical developments which, occurring in this early post-45 period, changed the course of European history. An historian can't make a stronger statement than that and maintain his guild credentials intact. Although now basically entering a phase of hibernation, which is how I describe it in my book, the EU remains alive and should be preserved until someone can find a better substitute for it. The EU has in the past rebounded from grave difficulties thanks to sound statecraft, to far-seeing, well-placed persons, but also in contexts that were changed as a result of events outside the borders of Europe. The tenacity of the European Union and its predecessor organization bespeaks evidence of a deep and wide pool of goodwill. It's very difficult. I'm saying the EU has made mistakes since becoming unpopular. But there still exists that flame of hope that it can realize its potential, however that term may be understood. But this pool of goodwill, like any form of capital, can be squandered and is being at the moment. A fresh reappraisal of EU policymaking is urgent. It's the first necessity of change, and far-reaching institutional overhaul will probably be required. But the European Union must also win public acceptance if it is to make progress towards some form of future political union. The EU can survive in the absence of such a goal and still make a valuable contribution to Europe's progress, but it will have reduced its importance from the primary to the secondary level. A Europe that does not concern itself with a future political union will have moved off the center stage of politics on the old continent. Thank you.